Autumn in Silver Creek by Ashton Drake. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the dusty streets of Silver Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1875. Eleanor Matthews pulled her shawl tighter against the autumn chill as she made her way from the general store to her brother's mercantile. The hem of her practical brown dress swept the wooden sidewalk, gathering dust that spoke of 3 months without rain. She paused at the sound of approaching hoofbeats, stepping aside as a group of ranch hands rode past. Among them was James Morrison, foreman of the Circle M Ranch, sitting tall in his saddle with an ease that came from years in the saddle. Their eyes met briefly, and Eleanor felt the familiar flutter in her chest that she'd been fighting for weeks. James tipped his hat, the gesture causing a lock of dark hair to fall across his forehead. "Evening, Miss Matthews." "Mr. Morrison." She nodded, keeping her voice steady despite the warmth creeping into her cheeks. The other cowboys paid their respects as they passed, but Eleanor barely noticed them. Her brother's voice cut through her thoughts. "Best come inside, Ellie. Storm's brewing." Thomas Matthews stood in the doorway of his shop, arms crossed over his vest. The sky behind him had indeed taken on the sickly green tinge that preceded the violent storms common to this part of the territory. Eleanor hurried inside, setting her purchases on the counter. "The widow Carson says we're in for a bad one." She began unpacking the paper-wrapped parcels, trying to focus on anything but the lingering memory of James Morrison's deep brown eyes. "Speaking of the Circle M," Thomas said, sorting through mail behind the counter, "Morrison was in earlier asking about you." Eleanor's fingers stilled on the twine she was unwinding. "Oh? I wanted to know if you'd be attending the harvest dance next weekend." Thomas's tone was carefully neutral, but Eleanor knew her brother well enough to hear the concern beneath it. "And what did you tell him?" "That it wasn't my place to answer for you." He paused, studying her face. "Ellie, I know you're fond of him, but—" "Thomas, please." She held up a hand. "I'm 24 years old. I can manage my own affairs." "Can you? After what happened with Richard?" The name of her former fiancé hung heavy in the air between them. Eleanor's spine stiffened. "James Morrison is nothing like Richard Phillips. He's honest, hard-working, and a cowboy with no prospects beyond working someone else's land." Thunder rumbled in the distance, emphasizing Thomas's words. "You deserve better than living hand-to-mouth on a foreman's wages." "I deserve to make my own choices." Eleanor gathered her packages with trembling hands. "And I choose to attend the harvest dance." The storm broke just as Eleanor reached the small house she shared with Thomas behind the mercantile. Rain drummed against the roof as she prepared supper, her movements sharp with lingering frustration. Her brother meant well, but he'd become overprotective since their parents' death 5 years ago, doubly so after Richard had jilted her for a banker's daughter in Cheyenne. James Morrison was different. She'd seen it in the gentle way he handled injured animals, in how he always had a kind word for the children in town, in the respect his men showed him. Yes, he was just a foreman now, but Eleanor had watched him save every spare penny, had overheard him discussing cattle prices and grazing rights with other ranchers. The week passed in a blur of routine tasks and furtive glances whenever James rode past the mercantile. Eleanor spent her evenings sewing new trim on her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes. By the time Saturday arrived, even Thomas had stopped making disapproving comments about her attending the dance. The town hall was transformed for the harvest celebration, decorated with autumn leaves and lit by dozens of lanterns. Eleanor's heart skipped when she spotted James waiting near the entrance, wearing a clean black suit that made him look even taller than his 6 feet. "Miss Matthews," he stepped forward, hat in hand. "You look lovely tonight." "Thank you, Mr. Morrison." She accepted his offered arm, aware of the curious glances from other townspeople. "James, please." His smile squinted the corners of his eyes. "I think we've known each other long enough for first names." "Eleanor, then." She returned his smile as he led her inside. The evening passed in a whirl of music and movement. James proved to be an excellent dancer, guiding her through waltzes and reels with sure steps. During a break between songs, he led her to the punch bowl. "I've been meaning to speak with you," he said, handing her a cup. "About something important." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "Oh? I've been saving up?" He glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. "The Bartlett place, north of town? Old man Bartlett's looking to sell. It's not much, couple 100 acres, small herd, but it's a start." "Your own ranch?" Eleanor tried to keep her voice steady. James nodded. "I've got most of the money, and the bank's willing to loan the rest based on my reputation." But he hesitated, studying her face. A ranch needs more than just land and cattle to succeed. Eleanor's hands trembled around her cup. What else does it need? A partner. James set aside his punch and took her hands in his. Someone smart and strong who isn't afraid of hard work. Someone who can see beyond what is to what could be. His thumbs traced circles on her palms. Someone like you, Eleanor? Before she could respond, shouts erupted from outside. The music stopped as people rushed to the windows. In the flickering light of the lanterns, Eleanor could see flames reaching skyward from the direction of the mercantile district. Thomas. She gathered her skirts, racing for the door with James close behind. They emerged into chaos. The fire had started in the livery stable and was spreading rapidly to neighboring buildings. A bucket line had already formed, but the wooden structures were tinder dry from months of drought. The horses. Someone shouted. James immediately ran toward the burning stable, joining other men in trying to free the panicked animals. Eleanor spotted Thomas directing the bucket line. She rushed to help, passing water from person to person until her arms ached. The next hour passed in a blur of smoke, shouting, and desperate work. Finally, the fire was contained. The livery stable was a total loss, but the surrounding buildings had been saved, including Thomas's mercantile. As dawn broke over the smoking ruins, Eleanor found James leaning against a water trough, his face smudged with soot. That was brave, she said softly, offering him a dipper of water. Going into the stable? He shrugged, wincing as the movement pulled at what Eleanor suspected were burned hands. Couldn't let the horses die. Let me see. She took his hands gently, examining the angry red patches on his palms. These need tending. Eleanor. His voice was rough with more than smoke. About what I was saying before. She pressed her fingers to his lips. Yes. Yes? His eyes widened. But I haven't properly asked. James Morrison, I've watched you for months. I've seen your kindness, your determination, your integrity. I know exactly what kind of man you are. She smiled up at him. And yes, I will be your partner, in ranching and in life. He pulled her close, mindful of his injured hands, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart soar. Around them, the town was already beginning to clean up and rebuild, just as it always did after disaster struck. Eleanor knew there would be challenges ahead. Running a ranch was never easy, especially for newcomers, but standing in James's embrace as the sun rose over Silver Creek, she felt nothing but hope for their future. 2 months later, Eleanor Matthews became Eleanor Morrison in a small ceremony at the town church. They moved into the modest house on what was now the Morrison Ranch, and Eleanor discovered that her brother had been wrong about living on a foreman's wages. They weren't rich by any means, but between James's careful management and her own skills at budgeting and bargaining, they built something sustainable. By the following spring, the ranch was showing a profit. Eleanor stood on their front porch one evening, watching James return from checking the herd. The setting sun gilded everything in gold, including the small swell of her belly where their first child grew. As James dismounted and walked toward her, that same smile on his face that had first captured her heart, Eleanor knew she'd made the right choice. Love, she had learned, wasn't about grand gestures or fancy promises. It was about finding someone who would face life's storms by your side, someone who saw the best in you and helped you become it. James reached the porch and pulled her into his arms, his kiss tasting of wind and sunshine. Around them, the prairie grass whispered secrets to the evening sky, and Eleanor smiled against her husband's lips, content in the knowledge that their love story was still just beginning.